Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we will be continuing to read Out of the Shadows, Reimagining Gay Men's Lives by Walt Odets. We're continuing on the significance of early life experience. And where we stopped last time was during the 8 ages of man. We read 1 through 4, and we will be starting today with number 5, Identity versus Role Confusion. The onset of puberty, usually around the age of 12 or 13, marks the end of childhood, the beginning of youth, and the period during which we first form social and sexual identities among peers. This is adolescence. If the gay boy did not earlier realize that he was different from other boys, he almost certainly will now. And now is the developmental period during which difference of sexuality, race, interests, talents, and even aesthetics and dress can be most significant and disturbing. According to Erikson, the growing and developing youths faced with this physiological revolution within them, body growth and genital maturity, and with tangible adult tasks ahead of them, are now primarily concerned with what they appear to be in the eyes of others as compared with what they feel they are. Among adolescents, the clannishness that differences spawn is usually a defense against feeling of identity confusion. In remaining within the clan, individual identity feels assured, even as the identity found is little more than a mimicking of currently stylish group identity. For obvious reasons, these are often emotionally difficult years for young gay people. Their identities are confused not only by the universal turmoil of puberty and adolescence, but because being gay makes them decidedly different from the majority of heterosexual peers. Heterosexual boys of this age often live with nascent, conventional, overly defended male identities, and gay boys who remind them of now unacceptable aspects of themselves are experienced as threatening. For that threat, the gay boy is usually ostracized and often actively abused. The experience of severe rejection, humiliation, and abuse during these years can leave a gay person with a confused, lifelong, highly reactive sense of identity. In the extremes, the reactive identity can take either of two, seemingly opposing forms. The first is expressed in an almost childlike desire to find one's identity in the affirmation and approval of others. Such a man has a persistent craving for insiderness and attempts to find his identity in the apparent fact or the given impression of conformity. This is a man who seems uncomfortable in his own skin and has the feel of someone living someone else's life while speaking someone else's words. The second form of reactivity inverts the first. Identity is sought in confrontation of the insider group, the larger conventional society, with an insistent, sometimes exaggerated assertion of precisely the differences that mark one as an outsider. This in-your-face approach is assertive, but just as reactive as the approval-seeking approach, and just as likely to be rooted in self-doubt. With a more benign, if never perfect, developmental experience during childhood and adolescence, a gay man's identity might be formed from an organically evolved mix of conformity and difference. This mix provides a relatively balanced, relatively comfortable, internally rooted sense of self, one that is more authentic, resilient, and durable than those of the two reactive solutions. With often painful adolescent experience as a developmental foundation, the early and late epidemics have also threatened gay men, not only with outsiderness, but with unwanted identities. For many men, the liberating identities that began building in the years following Stonewall became displaced by an identification with people who are promiscuous, sick, and contagious. If America had experienced gay men as pariahs before the onset of the early epidemic, the problem only worsened, and many young gay men today feel, resentfully, that they have inherited this legacy from older men. No longer unified by a struggle for liberation or a fight against premature death, gay men today live in increasingly fragmented communities that champion conflicting right and left political agendas. All of these relatively recent changes blur a sense of identity. The challenge for gay men today is to overcome the reactivity born of both adolescent experience and the two epidemics, and to discover or rediscover identities that are internally rooted, self-expressive, and revealed in authentically lived lives. One requisite for this task is the acceptance of diversity among gay men themselves, a diversity that is the inevitable product of the complex social evolution that has taken place over the past half-century. The gradually improving trend in America's acceptance of gay people has diluted the meaning of a gay identity. With that shift, and with our unified, single-minded purpose, today's gay communities make one thing clear. Taken alone, the fact of being gay is not much to have in common. We must each find ourselves. Number 6. Intimacy versus isolation. The first of Erikson's 3 adult developmental ages spans roughly the years between 18 and 35. During this period, we first grapple with the challenges of adult intimacy, which Erikson tells us is a capacity built on the foundation of a reasonably well-accomplished sense of identity. That hard-won sense of identity, which in turn builds on the earlier accomplished sense of autonomy, must be partially relinquished to allow intimacy. Intimacy thus requires relinquishing some measure of both autonomy and identity. To connect intimately with another, we must surrender part of ourselves, just as within the shared physical living space we surrender some of our territory. When the subjective sense of identity and its underlying foundation of autonomy feels too unformed or too vulnerable, we are often reluctant to relinquish any of it. Emotional intimacy can feel as if it threatens to subsume us. Almost all intimate human relationships tread a delicate, ever-shifting, often conscious line between independence and connection. The fear and avoidance of intimacy, Erikson says, may lead to a deep sense of isolation and consequent self-absorption. While this is certainly true, some people with a vulnerable sense of identity do enter relationships, but they usually prove problematic if one is hoping to gain an adequate sense of identity from the relationship. While relationships often help us discover new elements of identity, which is an important way that relationships help us grow, we rarely find an identity. The hope that a relationship will provide one is rarely fulfilled. Within an accepting and supportive society, one begins in adolescence to form an adult sense of identity. But gay boys are often denied the requisite acceptance and support, and beginning in their teenage years, and often earlier, gay men are often subjected to social forces that actively confuse or prohibit an authentic sense of identity. Gay teenagers often cannot talk to others about their lives and feelings, and they are often actively prevented from engaging in the exploration of relationships that is a natural and supported element of heterosexual adolescence. Gay boys are left with surreptitious sex that must be assiduously segregated from their social lives, and they too often experience that sex with shame and guilt. Because the sex is the only relationship they have been permitted to know, the shame and guilt are easily transferred later to potentially fuller adult relationships. Integration of sex and relationships remain difficult, and a deficit of intimacy is one consequence. A gay man once succinctly described the problem to me: I can't have sex with someone I love. The sex, still attached to the shame and guilt he experienced during adolescent sex, felt as it devalued or contaminated a relationship with someone he cared for. This troubling developmental path is not a consequence of being gay. It is a result wrought by a society that forcefully imposes destructive developmental limitations and then stigmatizes the result. Gay men are promiscuous and do not have relationships. Such a society is speaking out of both sides of its toothy mouth. Speaking about heterosexuals, Erikson makes an important observation about the difference between sex as physical behavior and sex as an expression of emotional intimacy. Strictly speaking, it is only now, in the age of intimacy versus isolation, that true genitality can fully develop. For much of the sex life preceding these commitments is of the identity-searching kind, or is dominated by phallic or vaginal strivings, which make a sex life a kind of genital combat. As one consequence of the societal imposed limitations on gay adolescent relationships, the sexuality of many adult gay men does, indeed, suggest identity-searching sex or genital combat. In having surreptitious sex with other boys, rather than fuller relationships, adolescents are nevertheless seeking to discover themselves in the only way permitted. In adulthood, sex with other men may be the only personal or social expression of an identity that some men have known. Such men are still trying to consolidate identities through sex alone. If, for gay men in truncated adolescences, the experience of emotional and sexual intimacy was already disrupted, the two epidemics have obviously compounded the problem. The disturbing emotional entanglement of sexual intimacy with HIV, sickness, and death left many men living through the early epidemic avoidant of any sexual or sexually intimate contact. When men did connect sexually, the experience easily mirrored adolescent sex. It was often unrelational and felt dangerous and, if conducted in defiance of the condom code, forbidden. Older group men often had such troubling feelings, and for younger and middle group men who have never known a gay life free of HIV, it has been the only experience of sex and intimacy that many have ever had. If, as Erikson asserts, isolation is the alternative to intimacy, the two epidemics have dramatically promoted the avoidance of intimacy in the painful safety isolation. With all the developmental and historical obstacles that have complicated gay lives and identities, a remarkable number of men have found authentic relational intimacy both before and throughout the two epidemics. Those hard-earned lives are the rewards of a remarkable tenacity brought to bear against pernicious developmental influences, and they stand in testimony. Today, the challenge for gay men is to discover, rediscover, or sustain authentic, reasonably robust senses of a broad gay identity that allows sexual and relational intimacy. It is from such identities that the fullest lives flourish. Number 7. Generativity. Number 7. Generativity versus stagnation. The age of generativity versus stagnation spans the middle portion of adult life, approximately the ages of 35 to 65, and is thus most pertinent for middle and older group men. Erikson tells us that generativity is about establishing and guiding the next generation, although he adds that generativity is meant to include productivity and creativity. The alternative to generativity is a pervading sense of stagnation and personal impoverishment. Individuals then often begin to indulge themselves as if they were their own, one and only child, and where conditions favor it, early invalidism, physical or psychological, becomes the vehicle of concern. For older group men, formerly productive and creative lives were often disrupted by the demands of the early epidemic. HIV-positive men were often forced by medical issues into early retirement from planned careers or creative work, and both positive and negative men otherwise found their lives redirected by uncertainty, trauma, and loss. Today, I often meet older men who feel that their lives are stagnant and disappointing, but they have given little thought to the influence of the early epidemic, during which they spent 10 or 15 of normally most generative years of our lives expecting to die. Many people, gay and straight, have feelings of stagnation or disappointment by the age of 65, and the onset of persistent grumpiness is one sure sign. Older gay men, like combat survivors, can often identify the responsible influences. For older gay men today, the formidable challenge is to acknowledge, rather than deny, the feelings of stagnation or disappointment. to grieve and release the unrecoverable loss of earlier, unrealized generative life, and to use what is left to live as fully, creatively, and productively as possible. Generativity can be realized at almost any age, and I sometimes find myself offering an obvious, often ignored observation to men who are attempting to grieve disappointing lives. We can only start from where we are, never from where we wish we were. This is sometimes a difficult reality to accept, particularly for those who cannot release their self-blame for what has derailed them. In the hope of redeeming their pasts, and thus themselves, they stagnate in a futile effort to redo what cannot be redone. If they can let go, men often find that creative pursuits, the nurture of old talents and skills, the development of new ones, and the mentoring of the young and valuable, life-sustaining opportunities. The essential feature of a happy human life is a sense of purpose, and from an early age we seek to discover it. In later life, we must often rediscover it. Number 8. Ego, integrity versus despair. And speaking of those living in old age, over 65, give or take, Erikson tells us, only in him who in some way has taken care of things and people and has adapted himself to the triumphs and disappointments adherent to being the originator of others or the generator of products and ideas, only in him may gradually ripen the fruit of these previous 7 stages. I know no better word for it than ego integrity. Ego integrity suggests a thoughtful acceptance of one's life and thus oneself. In that acceptance, we feel relatively whole and relatively fulfilled by how we have lived, and we accept what will transpire, including death. In the alternative to ego integrity, despair, we feel fragmented and at odds with all that we can no longer redo or control, including the inevitability of death. The lack or loss of this acquired ego integration, Erikson says, is signified by fear of death. The one and only life cycle is not accepted as the ultimate of life. Despair expresses the feeling that the time is now short, too short for the attempt to start another life and to try out alternate roads to integrity. Working with hundreds of dying men during the early epidemic, I saw repeatedly that, as young as many were, some died with relative acceptance and some felt only despair, struggling angrily to the end. Those who died with more acceptance were usually men who felt some sense of personal satisfaction and accomplishment, and they were almost invariably men who, at some point in their lives, had experienced requited love with another man. Those who fought death were too regretful and angry about what could not be redone, and, importantly, too disappointed in themselves to feel any acceptance of death. Thoughtful, authentic, self-forgiving, and self-acceptance are the useful resolutions for this age. For those gay men whose productive responses to earlier developmental challenges were significantly obstructed by stagnation and destructive family or society, and by the dislocation, trauma, and losses of the epidemic, simply learning to live with inalterable loss, disappointment, and despair is the final challenge. A word for the young. Erikson's 8 Ages of Man provides an inventory of seminal developmental challenges that all humans encounter. The less well-resolved, more vulnerable outcomes of these challenges include elements of mistrust, shame, self-doubt, guilt, a sense of inferiority, role confusion, isolation, stagnation, and despair. We all carry some mix of such feelings, and gay people are certainly not alone in this developmental legacy. But the life experience that gives rise to vulnerabilities in gay men is often different from, and more truly traumatic than, the experience of heterosexual peers. As described in my discussion of each of the 8 ages, many gay men today are survivors of a complex trauma rooted in early developmental experience in the two traumatizing epidemics. The two sources of trauma conflate into a composite trauma in which developmental challenges that arose in earlier life are re-engaged by new trauma and loss later in life. Such composite trauma can feel like a self-sustaining and immobilizing vortex that forever feeds back on itself, obstructing authentic, beneficial change. Every introspective and thoughtful person spends much of his or her life juggling and rejuggling responses to both new and re-engaged challenges. But too many gay men have been forced by family and society to do too much juggling. Some of us have been truly immobilized by a post-trauma vortex and accomplished change only with difficulty and true empathy and steady help. Others, through their own considered introspection, find ways to substantially break out of the vortex and thus bring beneficial change to their lives more easily. On the whole, gay people in America have found remarkable paths to self-realization, a miracle really, if we consider the noxious nurturing that so many vulnerable young lives are given. As subjective experiences, early and late life trauma have been in common, and importantly, the two act on each other synergistically. In recovery from early life trauma, the hope is that we will discover lives that are better than they have ever been. In recovery from late life trauma alone, the hope is more modest, that we will recover the ground lost to the traumatic event and, with new perspective and insight, perhaps something more. The recovery from either kind of trauma requires the examination of both, for in their synergy, each deeply influences the experience of the other. While this chapter's inventory of early life challenges and their beneficial resolutions provides objectives for gay men to consider, it does not provide a process for doing so. In Chapter 5, I will discuss some of the issues that can obstruct the process, including psychiatric diagnosis, isolation, unacknowledged grief, and problematic substance use. In Chapter 6, I will discuss late life trauma recovery itself, drawing on the seminal work of Judith Herman and others. While Herman writes largely about women's rape and combat survivors, her insights are highly pertinent to the trauma that many gay men have experienced, both in early and later lives. Young gay men usually have possibilities for change that many older men do not. Erikson orders the challenges of the 8 ages as he does for a good reason. Our psychological development is to some extent both progressive and cumulative. Progressively, within each challenge, the quality of the resolution sets the foundation for challenges that follow. The inability to trust during infancy predicts more difficulty with autonomy, which in turn influences the possibility of gaining adequate senses of initiative, industry, identity, and intimacy. Cumulatively, while the 8 challenges Erikson describes are never completely resolved, the accumulation of too many unsatisfactory resolutions can make it considerably more difficult to help bring change to unhappy lives. One needs to dig further down through the accumulated layers, and that denser stack of developmental events is more difficult to sort, examine, and reconstruct. The longer-standing, more codified histories of older people are often difficult to untangle and reconstruct in useful ways. Older men do often make significant changes in their lives, but they do it more slowly and with more effort. Younger people have accumulated and codified less, and with the resilience of still developing lives, they very often find easier opportunities for useful change. Because of this inevitable, if quite variable, difference between older and younger gay men, much of the remainder of this book is written for young men and their futures. Many of the stories in the following chapters are stories from older men about their younger years, but I tell them, in good part, for young men who may learn much from them.